School Teacher Workshop. So hopefully minute vignettes. I tried really hard this time to keep them to less than 10 minutes. So that way we would have more to talk about here, and I'm going to do my level best, as I promised in the introduction video, to make sure that I either am here or on Wednesday nights, or I'm recording in advance to have that posted, rather than leaving it open-ended and no more discussion had other than just the 10-minute video that I did. Hopefully, if you've had a chance to see that introduction video, or maybe watched a couple of the other little vignettes, you've seen this slide, and it's basically the center console of the entire slide deck presentation. I certainly don't mean to say that it's in the center of it. It's like the fourth slide, but it's from this that you have access to every single one of the lessons. So our second one happens to be Humanity Disobeyed God. When you click on it and then just simply swipe right, it takes you to the one slide, because there's only one slide for every one of these lessons that's there. So this week we're going to be focusing on Genesis chapter 3. And as you saw what the actual title of the lesson is per the Gospel Project writers, I am refocusing our effort here on this concept of the king priest that we talked about in last week's lesson, seizing authority for himself. Now, before I go into how this slide is arranged, let me just say, of course, there are several different directions that you could choose to take this, and we can't discuss all of them. It would take all of our 30-minute time block together tonight just to discuss what those possible options would be. I will say, though, even though in our classes we have a broad makeup of students, there is always the likelihood we might have someone who is new to the faith, and with that also may be new to biblical instruction. As adults, they probably have never sat in a Sunday school before, and so with that, they are on an elementary level. But of course, we can't always bring things down to their level and leave it at that level, while all of the rest of our veteran students who have been walking faithfully with the Lord for years are being left behind with respect to these kinds of very familiar stories. So what am I saying? It's always a challenge to try to meet the needs of the spectrum. But on that note, that challenge is helpful, since we don't have an introductory level class at this point where we can bring new converts into and walk them through a basic, fundamental, foundational knowledge of Scripture from beginning to end. I hope and pray that someday we will. I think that would be a great educational tool for our students, so that way they would feel more comfortable perhaps in adult Sunday school classes. We take care of that kind of stuff with respect to our kids and the youth in the programs and demographics that they're broken into. That being said, when it comes to a familiar story like this, and of course the Gospel Project writers are very keen on picking out familiar stories that most of us have heard if we've been walking with the Lord for several years, or at least been part of church culture for years, maybe even before we came to faith, and we're very familiar with what we might call these Sunday school stories. So Adam and Eve's rebellion in the garden, that probably is at the top of the list. I'm sure come Sunday when dear Wendy is sitting down in front of the stage, she'll probably ask a couple of questions in relation to this story, and kids' hands will be popping up left and right because, again, it's such a highly familiar story to many of us. That being said, I think this would be a great opportunity for us to go beyond just those basic elementary concepts of why did Adam and Eve sin? It's not to say that's not important, but we at this point could probably touch on that within a 2 or 3 minute time span and then move on to something deeper. And of course, there are all kinds of rabbit trails that we could start to trace as we explore this concept, right? I.e., who is the serpent figure and where does the serpent figure come from? When did the serpent rebel? Or better yet, when did Satan fall? On those kinds of questions. And in reality, those are worthy things of chasing down because, of course, there's a lot of theology tied to that. But even though that's the case, I would say some of those things could easily wind up commandeering the lesson and steering it in a direction that might not be fully productive for our students. But you're the teacher. I must, of course, encourage you to decide on what it is that you would like to teach. So what I have done here in arranging this particular slide, going from the top left to the bottom, and then, of course, up to the far right, is essentially pair up each of these gold blocks with a green block and then the corresponding gray blocks that all pertain to the gold block that it sits underneath, and they also continue to pair with green blocks. And then on the far right side of the screen, because I ran out of room to be able to continue to format like this, This gold block goes with the green one, and then the gray one with the subsequent green one underneath that. What I'm trying to do here is illustrate a concept of a pattern that's developing here in Genesis. Genesis is laying down so many different threads of thought for us to try to isolate. And in our brief time together that we have here, and of course with our students on Sunday, we have to be very careful and selective on what threads we're going to pull out and tease for them. But I think it's important for us to tease out this thread because it begins to set up a pattern throughout the rest of the Old Testament in which, and then there are some sprinklings of this in the New as well, that help us appreciate what the story is driving towards. Why does this story of Adam and Eve's rebellion even exist in Scripture? It does so more than just to simply teach us how sin came into the world, or even provide the anchor point for which Paul can write of and say Romans 5:12 when he says it was through the actions of one man that sin entered into the world and death by sin. It's providing a historical moment, sure, but there's so much more going on here because we might not realize it yet, but when we get deep into Israel's story, as I hinted at last week, Israel is to be seen as a corporate Adam. By corporate Adam, I mean essentially like the church is the body of Christ, many members, but we are yet one body under one head. All of Israel is seen like a corporate Adam to the nations. That's what's involved in the language that God is using at Sinai when he's giving them their purpose of why he calls them out of exile, to make them this royal kingdom of priests, right? So with that, when we appreciate what Israel is doing and why their story goes awry, and we match that up with all the stories that preceded from Adam to the Exodus out of Egypt, we can see very clearly there's an enunciation of a pattern there going on and just growing in momentum. So the first gold block is from Genesis 3, our host passage here, where the woman saw that the tree was good, delightful, and desirable for obtaining wisdom. Now, it's important for us to also appreciate the tree itself is not the epitome or embodiment of evil. God had not created anything that was in disorder or less than good, because he surveys all of creation multiple times and in one final swoop to say it is good. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is good. However, God provides a restriction of access to it now so that Adam and Eve would walk in the wisdom that God gave as he defines what's right and what's wrong, and they then would be able to utilize that, turning the knowledge itself into wisdom, all right? Because that is essentially where this story is supposed to be heading towards. When we get into the beginning of chapter 3, if we were reading the Bible for the first time and we see the serpent has crawled into the garden, our immediate sense of apprehension should not be causing the neck or the hairs on the back of our neck to stand up. Oh, there's a snake. This is bad. Because at this point, God has created snakes, and of course, snakes are good. Now, there is a separate conversation to be had as to whether or not this is an actual snake itself, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole with you here. That would take up all the rest of our time. That being said, when the snake comes into the garden, there's no reason for it not to be there until it speaks. Once it speaks, and as it begins to levy the questions it has regarding what God said, and then challenges what God said by actually not only undermining it, but even redefining what God's intent was for keeping them from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam, as the king priest, has a responsibility here, listening to the serpent, to judge, is what the serpent is saying right, or is what the serpent is saying wrong? So if he deemed it to be wrong, then he has discerned between both good and evil, exercising knowledge of what God has said. And of course, clearly, this is a direct contradiction to that, which must mean it's evil. Though Adam has never seen anything that's evil or unholy before, in being able to name all of the animals of creation that God has brought to him, he has exercised intelligence and a high enough level of it and the prowess necessary to be able to discern how this one's different from that one and why it should be called the name he gives it. So that being said, he can analyze what God has already clearly said that he's passed on to his wife and then judge that against what the serpent is using to challenge what God has said. And in the midst of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Adam, as king and priest, ruling over the garden, could have kicked the serpent out or killed it perhaps, and the story would have went a totally different direction. But clearly, we know what happened instead. So the woman saw, and by virtue of this, the king priest who was handed the fruit from his wife rejects the wisdom that Yahweh had offered him to rule, the tree of life. That's the wisdom he should be imbibing from, not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He can perhaps in time, but when God allows him to do so, not on his own terms. So as I go through the rest of these gray blocks, I'll do so rather quickly, and I'm not going to hit on all of them because we won't have the time for that. But I want to point out the pivotal word in each one of these and show you how the pattern develops. So when we move on just a couple of stories down, we get to Genesis chapter 6. And here we have the sons of God who seemingly are angels, if we consider a whole Bible theology of this from, say, Job 1 or various other Psalms and so forth. And if these sons of God are indeed angels, notice that they saw the daughters of mankind, that they were beautiful. So if they are angels and these angels choose to rebel and they pervert the seed of the woman, because of course in the context of Genesis 3, that's the only shining glimmer that we get of hope in the aftermath of what happened in the garden, that there will be a seed of the woman and there will be perpetual battle, enmity, animosity, hatred, conflict, but ultimate prevail between the woman and the serpent, the seeds that come from them, i.e. the race of human beings, and the fact that the seed of the woman will trounce the head of the seed of the serpent. So they rebel, they try to pervert the seed of the woman by creating demon spawn, or what is called in Scripture the men of renown, or better yet, men of the name. I mention that now because that's actually going to come up in a lesson in the very near future. But we move on from this. When we get into the story of Abram, several chapters later, Abram comes into the land of Canaan, finally, and then when he does so, he realizes there's a famine. He does not consult God on what he should do. Instead, he migrates further south, goes into Egypt, and while we could talk about the folly of Abraham in that, we're going to put that to the side. Instead, let's look at what the Pharaoh of Egypt does. Now, granted, Pharaoh winds up being not blessed, but cursed because of Abram's deception. But the fact is that Pharaoh is, in a sense, acting like the serpent in the story because he probably has many wives. And as ancient kings of old did, he has a harem where he just collects women. He sees that Sarai is beautiful. He wants to make her yet another wife. And in doing so, what happens? He ultimately threatens the covenant because the chosen seed must come through Sarah. Now, that's not been pronounced yet, but it seems to be implied that if that's the only wife Abram has, clearly children must be provided through that one. So at this point, with these three examples, we go back to the anchor story in Genesis 3, and we have a serpent who opposes the image bearers, the king and queen, priests in the garden, and we'll have several other characters in the rest of all of these other stories and the examples there where these people act like serpents. They act as if they are part of the seed of the serpent and not the seed of the woman. And granted, we have the woman who is now going to prepare or perpetuate a line that comes from her that, of course, will bear out Messiah, who will trounce the head of the serpent. But because she is Eve, the mother of all living, she will definitely give rise to lines such as that of Cain, who will be nothing less than the seed of the serpent and who will always be doing battle against the people of God. So Pharaoh saw Sarai, took her to himself. Then we go to Lot. After Abram and Lot wind up leaving Egypt, there's a lot of conflict between their two camps, struggling over resources and so forth. And so Lot and Abram decide to separate. And then when Abram gives the choice to Lot as to where to go, he looks to the west and he sees Canaan, but he also looks to the east and he appreciates that the cities of the plain and the area surrounding it looks like the garden of God. He lusts after it with his eyes, and because of the fact of what he saw, he chooses to go after it. And with that, the land of the inheritance was threatened momentarily. Now, it's not so much Lot that's at fault here, more Abram, but at the same time, because of the fact the dealings of the serpent were involved in the story, i.e. Abram and Lot could have found a compromise. They could have worked to remain together. Lot was being blessed by virtue of his proximity to Abram, even though the covenant promise was not to Lot. But now that Lot has gained from this, he wants to move on. But Abram, in a rather boneheaded way, decides that he would give Lot the choice. And if Lot had chosen Canaan, and Abram said, if that's where you go, then I will go in the opposite direction, Abram was destined to inherit Canaan and settle there, not the cities of the plain, Sodom and Gomorrah, that was destined for destruction. Thankfully, the Lord led Lot in the direction that he went to, and by virtue of that, the threat was alleviated. Or then several stories later, when we finally get even a few books removed from Genesis, and here we are in Numbers 14 when Israel is on the southern border of the land of Canaan, and they send the 12 spies in. 40 days later, they come back, and they give the report of all they saw, including the fact they saw the sons of Anak. And this takes the weight in the report. All the gravity seems to be sunk here with respect to the fact we're grasshoppers in their sight. They've built tall, walled, fortified cities. We have no means of being able to conquer them. If we go into the land, our wives and children will be slaughtered or enslaved, and we, of course, will be put to death. So by virtue of the fact they saw, they feared, they reject the Exodus itself, and they lose out on the land of inheritance, right? So we can go further, even to stories like Samson, when he saw the first Philistine woman he lusted after that he married before he eventually winds up with Delilah. So seeing her, like Eve before the tree, lusting after it, is what leads them into sin, and destruction is what comes from it. So I give you these examples that, like seeds, are far flung from the anchor story in Genesis, but it's to show you how this pattern builds over and again, and it's the continued animosity between the seed of the woman, seed of the serpent, and how it permeates and influences and guides these stories. So going to the next gold block. As we've already mentioned, God said to the serpent, I will put hostility between the woman, your offspring, and her offspring. So we've kind of hinted at that pattern a little bit with the fact that people act like serpents in the various stories that they're in, whether it's a person or people, and it brings destruction. Sometimes those are the actual good guys in the story, such as Abram, again, having a clouded moment of judgment, or it's the person who was the enemy from the get-go, such as the Pharaoh of Genesis 12, or the Amalekites that try to take Israel out in the wilderness. That being said, that is actually one of the examples in this listing of them. Because of the fact that there is promised enmity between them, it helps us better frame up and understand stories that come in the future, such as this very one right here, back in Genesis chapter 12. Why did the Lord strike the Pharaoh of Egypt with plagues? There are several answers to this. One of those happens to be, well, it foreshadows what's going to come when the actual Exodus movement occurs centuries later. Yes, but we're not there yet. We're not even at Genesis 15, where God promises Abram his children will move off to a land not their own and there be persecuted and stay there for 4 centuries until they're gloriously delivered out of there. So, yeah, it does foreshadow that, but that's not the only reason why this movement happens as it does. One could argue Pharaoh does not bless Abram. That's part of the Abrahamic covenant and call of Genesis 12:3. That for those who bless Abram, they will be blessed. But those who curse, well, they will receive their judgment. This is true. But in a sense, this is an injustice that's brought on Pharaoh because he was deceived. Moses makes it very clear to us that Abram concocted this plan out of fear rather than trusting Yahweh when he went to Egypt to try to find refuge there for the famine raging through Canaan at the time. So that being said, why does God so fiercely strike Pharaoh and all of Egypt with plagues during this time period? Well, because of what Pharaoh did, as we described it up here, this is the reason why. He acts like the serpent, and due to that, he winds up being spoiled himself. That's the whole reason why God seems to bring this very severe and harsh judgment upon him, is because of the serpentine character of this Pharaoh, even though he was deceived by Abram. Or we go to this moment in the actual Exodus story itself. Sorry, I meant to draw that line right there. This doesn't connect to that one. But when the Pharaoh of the Exodus story is chasing Israel out into the wilderness where they're pent up between Pharaoh's armies and the Red Sea, this is the reason why God brings the waters crushing down on top of Pharaoh's army's heads and kills them all, because like the serpent, they have been pursuing Israel out into the wilderness to decimate them, to completely cut them off at this point. So with that being said, because of the fact they are the seed of the serpent and providing a threat against God's covenant that he chooses to bring about through these people that are the descendants of Abram, they must be dealt with. So in a sense, if you think about it, Egypt, acting like the serpent, slithered their way after Israel, and of course the sea brought destruction to them, and they were ultimately crushed, as was promised would happen to the seed of the serpent in Genesis 3. Or then right after that story, Israel fights Amalek out in the wilderness. Now, this is a puzzling moment, if you think about it. Why is it that after this battle is over with, God pronounces that he will continue to do war against Amalek from one generation to the next? A very conflict that centuries later spills over into the stories of Samuel and Saul. And with that, Saul is encouraged and commanded to completely annihilate the Amalekites. Or again, later on in the story of Esther, when evil Haman, the Agagite, a descendant of one of these Amalekite kings, and a survivor perhaps of that conflict that happened in the days of Saul when he battled against Amalek and brought great damage against them. This is a story that sticks out as a testament to God's faithfulness to his promise, but at the same time it's rather perplexing because Amalek picked this fight, but they don't pick every fight between them and Israel. So why has God pronounced such a fierce judgment upon them and promises to annihilate them until they are completely wiped out from the face of the earth? This is why, because they act like the serpent, slithering out into the wilderness to be the ankle biters and envenomate or poison Israel by destroying them while they are fragile and vulnerable in the wilderness and haven't had time to coalesce an army or figure out how to fight. And of course, are learning how to be completely dependent upon Yahweh. It's one of the reasons why Moses' hands is in the air, they are winning, and when his hands are down, they're losing, because God is the one empowering and making it clear that victory is what he delivers, not men and their gifts. So, another one. Look at this. I think this is probably one of the more on-the-nose examples, if you will, because when Joshua is going through the land of Canaan and leading the period of conquest, they've just defeated Jericho. Ai and Bethel have now fallen. The king of Jerusalem has aligned several other kings from smaller areas toward him, and they are coalescing their armies together to go and fight against Israel. When the battle ensues, they are soundly defeated. Many of these kings try to run from the place of battle, and they hold themselves up in a cave. The Israelite army chases them down. They wall up the entrance to the cave with rocks until Joshua comes. And when Joshua gets there, he commands the cave be opened. The kings drug out. They are splayed out on the ground, and Joshua tells his commanders to put their foot on their necks and then wait, as Joshua tells again, what is going to be the fate of all those who stand opposed to Israel and her armies and ultimately her God. This is it. Their necks will be put under the boots. Look at the symbolism here of Israelites stomping on the heads of serpentine kings, commanders, and armies who have tried to chase them down, allied themselves against Israel and their God, and are ultimately receiving the head-crushing wound that God said would come to the serpent and his seed. Or again, I can't think of a more standout example than Goliath, who in his story is seen wearing bronze scale armor. And when David delivers the death-yielding blow, it's a rock sunk into his forehead, but then finishes him off, even though he's already dead, by taking his own sword, that being Goliath's, and chopping his head off. Again, headless serpent. This is exactly what the promised seed of the woman was supposed to do. So in every one of these, we have instances of men or people being crushed. This all goes back to Genesis. Now, a lot of times what happens is when we read Genesis and we get to verse 15 and we have the promise of the seed of the woman, the first thing we think of is Jesus. And we go on a catapult launch from Genesis to the Gospels. And we start thinking through the story of Jesus and his defeat, ultimate defeat of the serpent. That is absolutely important, yes. But what has happened over the generations where this kind of teaching has permeated our churches, we've forgotten the significance of this story in the rest of the stories. Because we have the Bible complete, but the Bible spent centuries in an unfinished form being developed as God continues to give revelation and as these stories are lived out. So we should read these stories between Genesis and Matthew with bated breath, thinking, who is up next to crush the head of the serpent? What next is the serpent going to do to try to prevent God's people from accomplishing mission one, the mandate promised to be fulfilled through Abraham and his seed, i.e. blessing all the nations of the earth? That's why these stories are constructed the way they are. If we go from Genesis directly to Jesus and we fail to see how this permeates all the stories in between, we can easily get lost or bored with the details, not knowing why they've been arranged as they have. So then we go to this final gold block. So the Lord sent them away from the garden, and there he stationed the cherubim. Probably one of the saddest tragedies in all of Scripture. The king priest made to serve and rule in this sacred space has now been permanently shut out of it. This garden temple is no longer a home to him. Rather, it's a place he can never see again as he's living out his exile, trying to accomplish his job of being king priest in a place that's not yet hospitable for that. So then we go beyond that. From there, the Lord scattered the people of the Tower of Babel. And why did that happen? Because they too, like the king priest in the garden who decided to not listen to God, but define right and wrong for himself, taking from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in an inappropriate manner and an inappropriate time. The people of the Tower of Babel, I don't want to embellish too much on this. We'll get to that story very quickly after this one at another time. But it's important for us to appreciate these people are not building a tower to heaven to evade another flood. It's not that they don't trust that God's going to be faithful to his covenant promise. It has nothing to do with surviving another disaster. Rather, it's an attempt to try to bind God in a cultic fashion that is expressing an occultic, so I've used two different words there, cultic fashion through the ritual of sacrifice, occultic by the use of dark power, dark magic, to essentially bind God in such a way that he would have to be prey to their whims. If they gave him what he requires, he must then quid pro quo give them what they need. Sun, rain, harvest, fruitful wombs of both man and animal, and as long as that contractual obligation is met, man can do whatever he wants to with the inclinations of his heart. God will have nothing of it. So because of that, instead of them accomplishing what was promised to Noah, being fruitful and multiplying, they are too scattered away from this artificial garden they tried to build. Or think about this, Exodus 32, when we have the Israelites who fell down, worshiped, and even danced around the golden image they made, calling it Yahweh, the God who led them from Egypt. What happens then? In seizing authority for themselves and defining right and wrong in that instance, after God had clearly told them don't do these kinds of things, and then devastation is wrought. 3,000 people lose their lives that night. Moving forward, Numbers 14, because of the fact they didn't trust God and defined what was right in their own eyes. Right was supposed to be entering into the land and receiving the inheritance promised to Abram, changing the world and accomplishing mission one. Right at the moment when they hear the report of the spies is kill Moses because he's not going to support this endeavor, appoint a new leader who is solely minded on going back to Egypt and will not deviate from that course. And then we go back and give ourselves over to the new Pharaoh and become perpetual slaves for the rest of our lives because at least we'll be taken care of there. God says, not a single one of you will enter this land and your bones will be scattered like dust in this wilderness. And they lose their inheritance. Or Judges chapter 2. After the conquest generation has died off, we have a lapsing generation who is choosing instead to do what they think is right, which of course is the theme that permeates the book of Judges over and over again, due to lack of kingship and guidance and direction. And with that, they are starting to syncretize the worship of Israel with the worship of the remaining pockets of Canaanites within the land. They're not remaining faithful, and then the angel of the Lord comes and says, I'm not going to drive these peoples out from amongst you. So because of that, instead of them getting the goodness of the promises of, say, places like Deuteronomy 28, instead they wind up becoming the tail rather than the promised head that would lead the nations into reconciliation with Yahweh. So again, I know you have options here as goes where you would want to go with this. I wholeheartedly encourage you as teachers, if you're teaching adults, consider the idea that you have students in your class who've heard this story at easily 24 times and probably would grow from a little bit more than hearing something along the lines of why Adam and Eve sinned or what was the nature of their sin. I'm sure they probably could tell you that in a 2 or 3 minute synopsis. Maybe consider going a little deeper with them in this, but you feel teach as you feel led to. And of course, I hope some of this is encouraging and may be helpful in that endeavor. So, any questions from anyone here in the audience? Well, if not, I appreciate your time.